ways that I approach death is through the lens of chaos, because I've been reading, and I've posted about this on my Instagram, this book, 7 Life Lessons of Chaos. It is part of my Witchy Studies series. The first unit of that series is on chaos and chaos magic. And I know I'm way behind in making the first video for that series, which will be a book review for this book and 2 others dealing directly with chaos magic. But academic work and the prospectus and shit got in the way, but I'm working on it. So I'm reading this book, and each chapter is a different lesson from the theory of chaos. And now this isn't a book explicitly about chaos magic per se, but it's spiritual wisdom from the science of change. It's about theoretical chaos within mathematics and science and climatology, and using that as a metaphor and as a way to approach life. And so chaos basically is this weird dance between self-organization and entropy. And so if you take the example of the Big Bang, boom, as far as we know, the Big Bang is the best theory we have for how the universe came to be as we know it. And so you have this massive explosion, and then out of that chaos of the explosion, all of a sudden, different stars came together and started self-organizing. Different galaxies started self-organizing. Different solar systems, started coming together and self-organizing. But chaos basically states that anytime you have self-organization, anytime you have a system that's definable as a system, whether that's a galaxy or an ecosystem or the climate, that system inevitably moves towards entropy. It starts to fall apart as soon as you can define it. And for me, the human body is just another one of those systems. Like, we are a complex systems of different muscle and bone tissue, different microorganisms and bacteria that live in our gut. We are an ecosystem for bacteria, both on the inside and on the outside. We are a complex system. We can be seen as, on the microscopic level, as a complex environment, right? So as soon as this complex system comes into being, it's already starting to fall apart. And that is the aging process. That is our natural movement towards death. And so this kind of leads me to another one of my points of how the relationship between life and death, how it's not just that death, the fact that we all die, kind of gives life meaning. It's the fact that you cannot have life without death. Every living thing on this planet, as far as we know, dies. Whether we're talking about the lizard that I saw crawling across the window earlier, or a human, or a tree, everything dies. Everything moves towards entropy. Everything falls apart and decays so that it can be reborn as something else, right? And that happens through decomposition and all sorts of different processes. And so defining death, which is tricky when you consider how many different societies and different philosophies have tried to define death, like what is death? That also implies the need to define life. And I'm listening to an audiobook, which I'll mention here in a second, but it's an audiobook specifically about death. And I've just started the first 2 chapters this afternoon, and the author and the reader for the audiobook was talking about how many different ways death is defined. Like, there's even disagreeing viewpoints about how to define death within the medical profession. Is it when the heart stops? Is it when the brain stem stops? Is it when the person stops breathing? Is it when their cognitive functioning stops? And there's lots of ethical implications for this. Can we harvest the organs of somebody who is brain dead but through machinery is still breathing and their heart is still pumping? How do we even define death? And so that interplay between life and death is just so fascinating, and it really is true. I mean, I believe that life wouldn't have a meaning for us as a species, as human beings, if we weren't so aware of our death and just how inescapable death is. And this kind of brings me back to the point I was trying to make toward the beginning of this video, is that's why it's so important to take time to talk about death, to think about it, to feel that fear come up. I cannot tell you how often I've just gone to bed at night, turned the lights off, and I'm just laying there staring at the ceiling thinking about my own death and how weird that is. And maybe that means we take our lives too lightly, or we don't appreciate them enough, because I don't know. But just thinking about that someday I, as myself, will cease to exist to myself. It's trippy and it's frightening. Like, it causes fear, and I think to a certain extent that fear is healthy, because that keeps us safe. Excuse me. It keeps us from running out into traffic. It keeps us, from in general. I think that instinct to keep living, if you want to call it an instinct, it's there for a reason, to keep us from participating in risky behaviors. But on the other hand, we can't really lose ourselves to that fear, because that's just setting us up. We're just going to set ourselves up for not handling our own death, and maybe even the death of others throughout life in a healthy way. And there are lots of different cultures that have approached this and the fear of death in different ways. Different mythologies have come up, different philosophical traditions and spiritual beliefs and practices. And one of the most helpful practices that I've found for myself is from Buddhism. And I can't remember the exact name of this practice, but it's basically the practice of sitting in meditation and imagining your own corpse rotting. So imagining your own body wasting away. And what it does is it helps kind of condition you to get used to the fact that you will die, and to also kind of loosen your grip on your attachments to this life, right? And just thinking about death is one of the best tools for gaining perspective on different problems. Just that kind of deathbed moment where you find yourself anxious and worried about something, and then you sit and think, someday I'm going to be on my deathbed. I hope I don't die in a violent manner. So assuming I die at an old age and I still have sound mind, I'm going to be lying on my deathbed. And in that moment, am I going to look back? Am I even going to remember this conundrum that I'm anxious about right now? And if I do remember it, what's my perspective going to be in that moment? Is it really that important? And that has helped me, I know for sure, that kind of deathbed perspective. I've reached for that tool several times throughout my life, even before I had a name for it. It's been very healing and helped me to really deal with my anxiety and my fears, not just about death, but my fears about a lot of things in life that I have to deal with and go through. So that practice in meditation of just imagining your own body dying and rotting away, it speaks to the impermanence of life. It speaks to transformation. And it's also a really good practice for the ego, because speaking in terms of in psychoanalytic terms, I think a lot of the reasons, there's so many reasons why in contemporary Western culture death is still such a taboo, and death has been taken out of the home and put into sanitized facilities, and death has just turned into something that we're not allowed to talk about, or something that we have to only fear. But I think one of the main reasons for that is because of our ego. I think a lot of ego problems, whether it's megalomania or narcissism or just unhealthy, unbalanced ego, comes from the fact that the ego, to me, the ego is the part of the self, the part of your construction of who you think you are, that strives for survival and identity. But we all know someday that identity is going to disappear through death. And so the ego freaks the fuck out and starts lashing out in different unhealthy ways in order to try to grasp at immortality. Its immortality, right? I think, man, this is a whole other video, but if we take your typical dictator figure, like, or wannabe dictator, I mean like the current US president right now, and we look at all the statues and all the gloating and all the megalomania and all the narcissism, to me that just speaks to their lack of attention to their own egos and their need to try to have some sort of power over death. But you can't have power over death. It's coming for you, you know? So instead of, letting our egos get out of whack and reach unhealthy states, maybe if we meditate about our own death and we accept it and we continually work on it and think about our own impermanence and think about our identities and how we construct our identities in different and more fluid ways, maybe we won't end up hurting other people along the way like we could if we do let that ego get out of hand. But that's my personal views on that. So I guess before I talk about the two kind of resources that I'm reading and listening to as I dedicate this time to death, and I do kind of view it as a dedication to death, as like an offering to death, because I am working with her kind of as, keeping in mind, for me, belief is a tool, but I'm working with her as a goddess figure, as a intelligent, a disembodied intelligence, right? What are my views on death? What do I think happens when we die? And this kind of goes back to that entropy idea. So, my views on death are going to sound very atheist. I do not think that there's any... I don't believe in a soul or in a permanent part of myself in the sense of like a soul, as I would say like a Christian might, for example. Like this idea that there is a part of yourself that is independent of your body and at death is released from the body and either goes to heaven or hell or something like that. I don't believe, most days, I don't believe that my idea of who I am as Rachel, the student witch, and as Rachel, under all the other masks and guises that I wear, I don't believe that any sense of Rachel as I know myself is going to continue after I die. Right? So in that sense, I do not belong to the camp of people or the approach to death that believes that there's some sort of permanent sense of self that exists or survives death. Whether that is in the form of reincarnation or whether that's in the form of the Christian heaven or Summerland or whatever. I don't think that's what happens. Reincarnation is an idea that I flirt with from time to time, but I'm not going to bank on it. I'm not going to set myself up for disappointment. So I just think I just stop, as I understand myself to be, I stop existing. Of course, I do continue to exist in the memories of others and in documentation and in my publications and blah, blah, blah. But as I understand myself to be, I no longer exist. So that's a scary thought, of course, and of course my own ego resists that. But what has helped me to kind of come to terms with it is to understand that the moment of death is when that veil that I hold in front of myself, that I use to define myself as something separate from the rest of the universe, that veil just falls down. And so in that sense, at the moment of death, when that veil falls, I truly become one with everything. Everything that ever was, and everything that is, and everything that ever will be. Because my sense of self is gone. It melts back into the whole. Right? And that is, to me, that's super poetic. That's a beautiful way to understand death. Because as long as we're alive and conscious and sentient beings and human beings, we have this sense of self, which is necessary and important and healthy, but we have this sense of self that separates ourselves from the whole. Cognitively, I know I am part of a greater whole. I know I'm part of my community, I'm part of my family, I'm part of my environment, but I'm also part of the whole of existence in the universe. I understand that. But I'm not going to be able to truly experience that until this sense of self goes away. And there are methods that we can do while we're still alive to help us approach that point. You can take, some people take mushrooms or datura or any of these other types of entheogens, and they kind of reach that point and start to lose their sense of self and start to feel connections with the whole. But eventually the mushrooms are going to wear off. Eventually you're going to return back to consensus reality, right? There are also, and you don't need to take entheogens or mushrooms or anything like that, you can also reach these types of states just through breathing and meditation practices, right? But eventually you have to return to consensus reality. So that means that we can't permanently lose that barrier of the sense of self until we die. And like I said, cognitively I know I'm connected to everything, and that's beautiful. But there's a difference between knowing and experiencing. And experiencing is just a different form of knowing, right? So that is my theory. Of course, I don't know. I mean, there could be reincarnation. There could be some part of me that could be described as a soul. Maybe if there is some sort of a soul at the moment of death, it's refracted in different parts and it's recycled in different lives. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to claim to know. I'm not going to claim that I'm right because I don't know. I do know that at one point before my life started, whenever that started, I didn't exist. So, in 1892, sure, some of the genetic material that would end up being me existed, but I did not exist. Well, in 2522, I'm not going to exist. So, that just helps me to appreciate the time that I do have as a sentient, conscious being, as a human on this planet. And, working to accept death and your own death, and working on healing and grieving, the grieving process, because death doesn't just touch you in the form of your own death. death touches you when the people you love die, you know? I mean, I'm 30 years old, my parents are in their 60s. I know in 15 to 20 years I'm going to have to face that, if not sooner. Hopefully not sooner, knock on wood. But I know my parents are going to die. I know some of my friends might die before I do. Or they might have to deal with my death first. It's important to take time to talk about it and to think about it and to feel through it. It's basically the general point of this video. So yeah, so basically really quickly, just a couple of resources I'm reading as part of my dedication to death. I'm reading The Art of Death by Edwidge Danticat. Edwidge Danticat, she's perhaps most well known for her novels, especially this one, The Farming of Bones, which is an excellent novel. I'm not going to get into that right now, but if you love historical fiction, and especially if you don't know much about the history of Haiti and the Dominican Republic and the massacre that happened in 1937 on the border of those two countries, you need to read The Farming of Bones. But that's what she's most well known for. But this is part of a series, the Art of series, and it's a series specifically about writing for writers. And so she wrote the edition of the series about death, and she approaches or talks about what does it mean to write about death from an author's perspective, but also from the perspective of someone who fairly recently lost their mother, because her mother, she opens in the beginning, in the introduction, telling the story of her mother's cancer diagnosis and her mother's death as a Haitian immigrant in the United States. So I've just started this, so I still have a while to go, but one chapter at a time, I'm reading The Art of Death, writing the final story, and I'll have a link to that below. And I'm listening on Audible. If you have an Audible account, you have access to the Great Courses series. The Great Courses is a series of lectures on all sorts of topics written by and read by professionals, like academic professionals. And so if I quickly, let me look at my library. I have several. I have the Great Courses series, Great Ideas of Psychology, and it's 12 hours long. I'm not even halfway through, but it tells basically the history of psychology, which has been really fascinating. The Great Mythologies of the World, that's a 17, almost 18-hour long lecture series that you have access to. But I started with Practicing Mindfulness, an introduction to meditation. I can't remember how long that one was, but it's all part of the Great Courses. You've probably heard of the Great Courses Plus program. I think you can sign up through them, but if you have an Audible account, you have access to a lot of their lectures. And so there's a lecture, it's 11.5 hours long, called Death, Dying, and the Afterlife. Death, Dying, and the Afterlife, Lessons from World Cultures. And it's read by or presented by Professor Mark Berkson of Hamline University. And I've read or listened to the first 2 chapters, and it's excellent. So Death, Dying, and the Afterlife, if you have an Audible account or access to the Great Courses program, take a listen. He's going to approach death through the lenses of biology and medical science, through psychology, through mythology. Really fascinating stuff. So yeah, take some time to sit and have a think or two about death. It's been super healing and fascinating to me. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a long-ass video, but hey, death is a huge topic, and I didn't even scratch the surface of it here in this video. And just if anybody out there is going through the grieving process, I hope you find some healing, and I hope you can work through it and just know that you're not alone, because we've all experienced death, or we've all had death touch our lives in some way. So just find comfort in that if you can, and my heart goes out to you. And just in general, you comment below, what are your thoughts about death as an experience, as an idea, through mythology? Like, has there been a particular mythological story from a different culture that has helped you think about and approach death, and think about and formulate your own ideas about the afterlife, if there is one? And this is such a complex topic. So yeah, I'm really interested to see what people think. So yeah, Memento Mori. Yeah, until next time, many blessings, and I hope everybody has a blessed season of death here in the northern hemisphere, and for those in the southern hemisphere, a blessed season of life and light. Bye.